Manion, and I'm the Executive Director of the PCD Foundation and the parent of an adult with PCD. And we are so excited that everyone could join us. This is the first in what we're hoping will be a series of webinars helping our patient community get ready to participate in research, because there is a lot of exciting stuff coming down the pike for us finally after years of preparing for it. And we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with what research means, with what's available, what opportunities are available, and how they can participate. So I am, first of all, apologize for canceling last week. I'm still not 100%. We have a lot of folks on here that are clinicians, researchers, experienced people, and please feel free to jump in, especially if I have to take a little break for coughing fit. The one thing that's really nice about presenting to this group is you all understand how that works. So with that, we will just kind of get going. So we're calling this Clearing the Way for a Cure, an update on PCD research. We recently had a logo and branding change, and our tagline is Clear the Way. And the idea is, of course, clearing lungs, but also clearing the way to a cure for PCD. So I wanted to talk about our vision. We are a patient organization. So the organization is run by patients, it belongs to patients, and our vision is to be a patient-focused organization that will provide the leadership and resources necessary to support primary ciliary dyskinesia research, accelerate PCD diagnosis, improve the health of affected individuals, and find a cure for primary ciliary dyskinesia. That is an updated vision. When we first started, we did not include the search for a cure in our vision because we felt like it was so far away and so unlikely. We didn't want that to end up being a negative, but we do not feel that way anymore. We think that we are on a path right now because of the collaborative work of many people across the world for many years, that there are real possibilities for a cure and certainly for much better treatments in PCD in the future. So for the purposes of this discussion, I am not a scientist or a researcher. I am a parent who had to also learn kind of what research means and how it works in small patient groups like ours. And so we're talking about a systematic, rigorous, objective, and unbiased effort to develop an evidence base that will give us information about PCD. And so what that means in reality is that always there's a search for answers, but sometimes there's also a search for the right questions. And that's because research tends to be a process that is iterative, meaning that observations and findings provide the foundation for additional observations and findings. And I do remember early on in the history of the foundation, we would see papers get published, things would be coming out, we'd be learning things, and it sometimes felt overwhelming because the more we learned, the more we realized we didn't know. So sometimes that search for questions can be just as important as the search for answers. And I think this, one of my favorite quotes, it's variously attributed to Isaac Asimov or Alexander Fleming, the guy that found penicillin, but it doesn't really matter. The quote is that the most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but that's funny. And I think we've had a lot of that's funny moments in PCD where things that we did not expect actually could provide guidance on different paths for research. So in the context of PCD, we're mainly going to be talking about clinical research, but I just want to give a shout out to basic science research and the people in our orbit who have done the basic science, who continue to do basic science to provide a foundation for us to move into clinical research. And basic scientists will ask questions like, what is the mechanism behind ciliary motility? How are cilia formed? Which ultrastructural components are important in health, which in disease? Can we describe or visualize the structures? What changes in cilia result in loss of function? What proteins are important? Which genes are associated with these proteins? So they really provide a foundation to build on clinical research. And a lot of clinical researchers are both basic science researchers and clinical science researchers. The little green guy in the corner here is Chlamydomonas, an artist rendering of an algae called Chlamydomonas. And I want to just point that out because a lot of times basic science research, especially in the political arena, is poo-pooed as being a waste of money. Chlamydomonas has two flagella. You see the two little whip-like things at the top there. And they are structurally and genetically very similar to PCD. So to cilia, excuse me. A lot of what we know about cilia dysfunction and ciliary genes came literally from pond scum. So just keep that in mind the next time a politician tries to convince you that money spent on basic science research is wasted. It's not done to improve the lives of chlamydomonas. It's done to provide answers that can be used for other scientific purposes and even to help human beings. So clinical studies are studies that involve human beings. So they can also be called human subjects research studies. And they're done to teach us more about PCD, or the disease under study, to provide insight into potential therapeutic targets and to lead to meaningful interventions that will modify the course of the disease, so treatments that really can be helpful, and ultimately to improve quality of life and hopefully lead to a cure. And there are two types of these studies: observational, which are generally considered low risk, and these are things where you're not introducing any sort of a therapy or an intervention. You're just watching what happens naturally. So what's the natural history of the disorder? Are there variations in certain populations, and why? Are there predictable patterns? And do age, race, ethnicity impact disease expression? These are things that you might want to learn from an observational study. Just examples. There are lots of things that are done as observational studies. Interventional studies, also called clinical trials, are generally considered higher risk, but it depends on what the intervention is. And they're primarily looking at, will the introduction of an intervention, whether it's a drug, a therapy, diet, education, training, any sort of an intervention, change the course of a condition in a way that can be specific and can be measured. So observational trials, you can think of as getting to know you trials. And they really are a study in which individuals are observed or certain outcomes are measured. And natural history studies are a critically important type of observational study. And you will learn more about this as we go on. But the importance of natural history studies is that when you are looking to introduce an intervention, you need to understand what the baseline is to know if you've actually made a change. And that information comes from natural history studies. So examples of observational studies, PCD registries, both in North America and in Europe. These are long-term natural history studies that collect data over a long time on patients with PCD. There's a large PCD International COVID survey project. So this would be an example of an observational trial that's specific to a situation. In this case, it was, how do PCD people do during the pandemic? And now, because it's been quite successful, we are looking to expand that into other topics. And this is, again, survey-based. So patients answer surveys from around the world. And if you want more information on any of these studies or you want to participate, please feel free to ping me or Lynn at the foundation, and we can make sure you have that information. It's also available on Facebook. I got to go back here. And then there have also been studies by GDMCC, Genetic Disorders of Mucociliary Clearance Consortium, in North America and European centers across Europe to validate PCD diagnosis and to start developing a very reliable picture of PCD. So when we talk about interventional trials, the clinical trials, those are usually where an intervention is a drug, biologic, therapeutic device, medical food, etc. These are very highly regulated. In the US, the regulatory body for these kind of trials is the FDA, and they're constrained by, or they have to follow Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So this is a huge, you're certainly welcome to look this up and read through it. It's pages and pages and pages of legalese. But just to kind of condense this quickly, what the FDA requires, because they're concerned about safety and they're concerned about efficacy of new drugs that they're going to approve, you have to prove that through adequate and well-controlled studies. So there's specific language to that again, if you're very interested, you can certainly read, but they want specifically for people bringing in a new drug to them to prove that the target of the intervention is sound. So if you wanted to do a study in a PCD population, on a drug that regrows hair on your head, that is not an intervention that is sound or useful for that that population. So that's obviously an extreme example, but there are some examples where the target was not really clear that it was sound for the population being studied. Is the study design sound? That means you set this up so that you will be able to prove there's a statistical difference between your intervention and normal progression of the disease. That includes having enough patients, having the right patients, and making sure that there are no confounding variables. Study design is a huge topic, and we won't cover that here. We'll do that in a later webinar, but just know that that's a big part of what the FDA is looking for, and that we need to be aware of as a patient community that's participating in or helping drug manufacturers who want to go to the FDA and get an approval. Another big one, and this is one where we certainly have challenges, are the participants properly identified and diagnosed. FDA is not going to want to approve a drug that was done for a population that was done in a population that may be not correct. So, for instance, they're not going to want to approve a drug for use in PCD if the testing wasn't done in patients who have verified PCD. So this is why we have some emphasis on diagnosis. It's not to be exclusionary. It's because we're trying to help meet that adequate and well-controlled study definition. And of course, there always has to be a focus on bias. But I think the biggest one for us as a patient community is the intervention clinically meaningful to the participant population? And that can be kind of a challenging one to prove, because when you're talking about the FDA, we're talking quantifiable measures. It's not just you can say, yeah, we feel much better after doing this treatment. They're going to want to see some proof of that and be sure that that proof means that it actually benefits the patient population. So how do we get to research now that we know what we're talking about? So this is a picture from 2002. This was our first foray into the world of research, pulmonary research in Atlanta in 2002. And that is me and my daughter and a friend I roped into helping us. So we started, this was our first official presentation, and we started the foundation with $2,500 in a donated booth at the American Thoracic Society meeting in 2002. And of course, looking at the need for research in PCD and how many millions and millions of dollars were required, it was very daunting and overwhelming. So as a small new patient group, we really weren't going to be able to do a lot of that on our own, but we knew we wanted to focus on research and to accelerate that so that patients had better therapies. And so what we did was partner with the researchers at UNC on a large NIH-sponsored research consortium project called the Genetic Disorders of Mucociliary Clearance Consortium. So in 2002, we were at ATS. In 2003 or 2004, we started enrolling or applying for the funding for the Genetic Disorders of Mucociliary Clearance Consortium, which is still ongoing. It's a very robust consortium that exists to this day. And here are the GDMCC sites. The initial principal investigators for the GDMCC were Margaret Lee and Mike Knowles, both from UNC Chapel Hill, and now the GDMCC is being led by Stephanie Davis at Chapel Hill and Thomas Ferkel from WashU in St. Louis Children's Hospital in Missouri. So I have many of you have probably participated, but I do have the website there if you want to look and see what the GDMCC has done. But for almost 20 years now, the GDMCC has been focused on creating that foundational network building blocks that we need to go into clinical trials. So I believe there are GDMCC clinicians on the call. If you have anything you'd like to add, feel free to jump in now about GDMCC goals. If not, we will save that for later. So from the success with the GDMCC, we were encouraged to built upon that. So we had 8 GDMCC sites that had no problem finding patients to see that wanted to be evaluated for PCD and be entered into 2 trials for PCD. So from that, we developed what we call the path to clinical trials. And this is, we spoke with Bob Bell at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Dr. Bell had done a fantastic job, as we know, directing cystic fibrosis research to the point where they have really incredible therapies. And he suggested to us that we create and expand our network of clinical and research centers and develop a registry and package the 2 of them together as the Path to Clinical Trials program. So that's what we did. That started in about 2011, I believe, is when we first announced it. And now that all of these slides are out of date because we cannot keep up with the changes all the time in our clinical centers network. But it has grown to 40 sites, 40 plus sites in North America, and it is expanding all the time. We have more interest than we can actually manage right now. And Dr. Adam Shapiro from McGill University is the center's network medical director. So he is the person that helps us manage the clinical centers network and helps us with adding new people and getting ready, prepared at these centers for research. Additionally, we have a registry that is up and running. It is still in pilot phase, but we'll be opening up to the centers very soon here. And that is, the medical director for the registry is Michael O'Connor at Vanderbilt University, and the person at the PCD Foundation who is the director of the registry is Carrie Kaufman. So you may have heard of both of them. You may have questions about how to become part of the registry, and we will be addressing that also on a separate webinar. For now, the entry into the US PCD Foundation, or I should say North American PCD Foundation registry, is through an accredited clinical center only, but we are looking at ways to expand our reach so that other people who are not able to get to a center will be able to participate. We also have created a medical and scientific advisory council to help give us guidance on research priorities. This is run by Dr. Margaret Lee out of UNC and includes adult and pediatric pulmonologists and people that have some expertise at bioinformatics. And we have 2 members from Europe who are part of this board. And we feel like it's incredibly important because this has to be a global effort to get research done if we all cross participate. And it's been really a wonderful experience so far. Most collaborative kind of relationship with our partners in Europe, in Australia, in Israel, and around the world. But we also will be creating, as part of our effort to get everybody ready for clinical trials, a patient and family advisory council. And the role of this council is going to be to make sure that the patient voice is always heard and is always front and center when we start talking about research, about what matters to patients, about what research we want to prioritize, about study design, what patients actually can do versus what's ideal. So be looking for that. It is very, very important to us that this is a inclusive group. And so that patients from all walks of life, of all genders, and ethnic and racial backgrounds, that everybody is included in this, because we've got to make sure that all voices count. So be looking for more information about the Patient and Family Advisory Council. We recently received funding from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative as in their part of their Rare as One program. And this will also accelerate hopefully our access to research or help us to participate more fully in research. The goal of this grant will be to extend access to genetic testing throughout the Americas. So not just North America, but South and Central America as well. And we are hoping that with being able to get more genetic information, get people diagnosed, it will help people be able to participate more fully in research. Genetic diagnosis, as you'll see in upcoming slides, is going to be very, very important, because some of the research opportunities that we're looking at right now are based on your genes. So I know that this is an area of frustration because we don't have all the genetic information we need, and there are people with PCD who cannot get their genes identified right now. Obviously, we're working hard on that, and there's a global effort to identify genes and make sure everybody can participate. But for those of you who have not had genetic testing, I would really strongly recommend that you consider it, because some of these therapies and some of the research required to get to the therapies is going to require you to know the genes. So this is, you're probably going to think this is silly, but this is exciting to us. So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has always had a pipeline of their therapies, and they can tell you exactly where all of their different therapies are at. We still aren't quite to pipeline yet, but we do have now a lot of interest in coming from drug developers in PCD. And so I just wanted to kind of lay out how we're thinking about this with what interest is out there right now. And this will undoubtedly evolve over time and hopefully soon become a pipeline. But in terms of symptom-focused therapies, so those would be therapies that are designed to help deal with the symptoms of PCD, but not really looking at trying to change the underlying genetic factors that cause PCD. But this would be things like mucolytics, mucus thinners, airway hydrators, and the red stars at the bottom are indications that we have pharma companies who have reached out to us that have an interest in developing drugs for PCD in these areas. So, so this is really very exciting. Antibiotics, both inhaled and oral, and anti-inflammatories, specifically non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, sometimes for inhalation, and I think pretty much mostly inhalation is what we're looking at now. We also have companies that are interested in doing what's called mRNA transfer therapy in PCD, where it would be kind of correcting the message that the gene gets and producing the correct protein without editing the actual genome. So those are very exciting therapies, and we're hoping to move forward with that rapidly. Gene editing is another option, possibly for the future. We're not quite there yet. We don't have really anyone interested in gene editing in PCD at this point, but things are evolving rapidly. And then there are regenerative therapies, so stem cell therapies. Nothing really to report there yet either, but I think we want to stay focused on all of these because we want to make sure that everybody in the PCD community will have access to something that will help them. If your lungs are really already advanced disease, some of these therapies are probably going to be less helpful for you, and regenerative therapy would be a better option. So this is kind of a quick snapshot of what we are looking at and where we're at right now with those things, all of those categories. And I guess it's just our message to you that together we can clear the way to better treatments. This really is up to us as a patient community because no one else can do PCD research for us. We are challenged by having a small population. And so even more than another disease, every person counts. There's not anybody whose data is not going to be important to our future efforts. So, and we understand that it doesn't work for everybody to participate in research, and there are inclusion, exclusion criteria, things that may make it not possible for you. So I guess the message is, to the extent possible, we want to support you to be able to participate in research. And so then we can clear the way to get you a cure for PCD. And I think with that, I will take questions, comments. One thing I do want to mention is the next webinar in the series will be with Kelly Sullivan, who is Research Coordinator Extraordinaire from UNC. And she's going to give patients a glimpse in what it actually looks like to participate in a research study, what the informed consent process is, and what you can expect as a patient participating in research.
There is a question, how do bronchiectasis studies impact, help, or hurt PCD?
It's an excellent question. So this has been an area of frustration for us. PCD gets lumped broadly with what's called non-CF bronchiectasis. And so a lot of times studies in non-CF bronchiectasis will include PCD patients. But generally, there are not enough patients with PCD in these studies to be able to look at how the drug or the intervention affected people with PCD specifically. So if the whole study doesn't support the use of a drug, the whole study fails, including the PCD arm of it. And sometimes we've had several cases where people that had PCD in these studies did feel like the intervention was helpful, but because the overall study failed, suddenly they're unable to get these drugs to use even off-label because it is a failed study. So it's a tough call because we want people to be able to participate in research, but if the study design doesn't support PCD, it can actually be harmful to participate in these studies. I guess what I would recommend is to be very upfront with the provider who wants to enroll you in these studies. Talk about concerns and see if they can provide some guidance for you on that. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading this, Mary.
Yeah, just sort of a follow-up. So if part of the FDA design is to be a good inclusive and to look at biases or try to weed out biases for bronchiectasis studies, shouldn't they make sure that there's a good representation of the etiologies, the different etiologies in bronchiectasis? So making sure there would be a certain percentage of the different etiologies. I know that would make it harder to enroll. And then also sort of a question based on what you were just saying in enrolling in the bronchiectasis studies. I mean, it seems like since it's a bronchiectasis study in general, whether PCD patients enroll or not, if the study is found to not help or be negative to bronchiectasis as a whole, even if there were no PCD patients enrolled, it would still impact PCD patients with bronchiectasis.
Possibly, although I think that you would have a better chance of being able to get it covered as an off-label treatment if you didn't have a failed study. And we have had several instances of that where all of a sudden people who've been using a drug forever successfully can't get it anymore because it was a failed study in bronchiectasis. So I think your point about shouldn't they include all etiologies? Yes, they should, and there should be percentages that you can do stratification by disease. The problem is these people aren't out there. So even if they have the best desire to make sure that there are enough patients with PCD, actually recruiting enough patients with PCD for these studies can be hard. And I think the other thing, etiology thing, just for us to be thinking about as a group, and please, physicians, please jump in here. This is just me as an observer. PCD and, they call it non-CF bronchiectasis because cystic fibrosis bronchiectasis is considered separate. It looks different. It's a different kind of bronchiectasis. Well, I think you could make an argument that PCD bronchiectasis is a little different too. For one thing, it starts, according to one study, 40 years earlier on average in PCD than in other forms of bronchiectasis. So I think the problem with including all the etiologies, and I know you and I have talked about this at length, is the apples to oranges kind of analogy. Somebody who has bronchiectasis because they inhaled something and they have a focal area of bronchiectasis is a very different etiology than to having a genetic disorder where the entire lungs on both sides are affected. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's an area where we need to probably have some more observational studies and figure out what makes the most sense. Did that answer your question, Mary?
Yes.
Okay. So the next question is, will any future clinical trial opportunities be communicated through PCD Foundation emails and the website? And do we have an update on the Clean PCD trial?
Yes, they will be communicated through website and through probably our social media and emails as well. Clean PCD trial, I hesitate to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Carl Don is on the call here. Carl, do you have an update on where that's at?
Yes, thanks for an excellent seminar. It's I think it's been a great topic, and it's I think it's very timely with the potential therapies that are coming along for PCD patients. So that's good. The PCD trial is completed now. We've got results of that, and we're pleased to see those results, and they will be published soon. And as a result of those studies, we will continue on with more studies in the PCD population. So we're preparing to do those studies. And I think Michele raised several important points that you have to look very closely at the studies and see who the studies are for. And one of the things that we did run into with the Clean PCD trial was a misunderstanding around the inclusion and exclusion criteria. That any study that's done is very rigid in terms of the population. And even though that study was designed to include patients with PCD, there are restrictions on which patients with PCD can participate in a study like that. So it really has nothing to do with whether you have a PCD or not. There's a lot of other restrictions in terms of the population. And I guess so that it certainly impacts with other therapies, the kind of patients that would be recruited into those studies. So if they're a gene-specific study, of course, it would be only that subpopulation of PCD patients that meet those criteria. So the Clean PCD study, as I said, was completed, and its publications in preparation now. Does that help?
Thanks, Carl. Michele, could you speak to kind of piggybacking off of Carl's comments? And I see sometimes in the patient groups people talking, so exclusion, like every study is different. So if you're excluded from one study, that doesn't mean you'll be excluded from another, because all of the inclusion is different for every study. That
is correct. Yes, and it kind of depends on the intervention that's being planned. So sometimes people may be excluded because it could confound the data that comes. It could make it hard to know whether the intervention actually is what's responsible for changes that are seen. So if you are not eligible for one study because of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, do not assume that means you'll never be eligible for a different study, because it is very much study specific. That's a great question.
With such a small patient populations, it seems like it would be hard to do more than one study at a time, depending on the type.
Yes,
Studies.
Exactly that. It's one of the things that we're worried about, and why we have to have a global collaboration, because we have a very small population of eligible study participants, and we're going to have to probably prioritize. And I know that seems kind of frustrating, but let me tell you, it's so exciting that we may have more interest in research than we have people to do it. Is a good position for us to be in right now. So it just means that as a community, we have to really be focused on supporting these opportunities that come up, so that we don't lose interest, which is one of the things that we can be a little bit concerned about. We have a question about a checklist for PCD that provides guidance for getting a diagnosis. And there actually is an algorithm. It's a flow chart that is published in the American Thoracic Society Journal, and there's also a European diagnostic guideline, and both of those can be helpful. And certainly you could share them with your physician. Just send us an email, and we'll make sure that you get that information, and we can even post that on the website, the flow chart for diagnosis, if that would be helpful. One of the things that would be extremely helpful is that studies, and I know that this is difficult, it's not everyone can do this, but the studies that we're looking at right now are probably mostly going to be recruiting people that are seen at PCD centers, accredited centers. So we have a network here of accredited centers. There are PCD expert centers in Europe. That is who these drug developers are going to, because they want to be able to be sure that they're targeting the right populations. So if you are not affiliated with a center and you would like to participate in research, that would be one good first step. get yourself to a center just to, even if you don't intend to follow all the time at the center, just to confirm the diagnosis and be entered in the registry and get yourself in a position that you can be contacted about these studies.
One question I see that people ask, and myself included, because I also am an adult PCD patient, is the genetic confirmation for the registry. So I've participated in research, but I've never been to a clinic. So would I have to go to a clinic to be enrolled?
So if you've been through one of the GDMCC studies or another research study and had genetic testing done and it came back with a positive result, you can be entered into the registry. We have the ability to distinguish between research genetic testing and clinical genetic testing. And just so everybody understands, research genetic testing is considered separate. To have a genetic test that is diagnostic, that actually confirms the disorder, it has to be done at what is called a CLIA certified lab. So sometimes if you have research results, but you do not have CLIA results, you need to have them redone through a CLIA lab and to participate in different trials. But for the registry, that's not a requirement. The registry, we accept the research results as well.
Thank you for that. And so just to clarify, like if I had been able to be included in the carry-on study, I would have had to have my genetics rerun because it wasn't through the centers. So it was, or CLIA, it was through research.
Correct.
Okay.
And ideally they match. But.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions or anybody have comments they would like to jump in with?
Michelle, I guess one of the things for patients or parents out there, just to clarify that, and I always butcher the acronym, but the Cilia group consortium. So like UNC is not a PCD center.
So right now, how we have this set up is the GDMCC sites are kind of the primary research sites around the country, and they're loosely affiliated with the PCD Clinical Centers Network. But right now, there's not probably a need for them to become an official PCD center. So we include them in all of our materials, and they participate in a lot of the other things. But the PCD Clinical and Research Centers Network is actually separate from the GDMCC.
And those centers are not entering people into the registry at this time. Is that correct?
Actually, at this time, no, we have just 5 pilot sites entering, but eventually some of the pilot sites are GDMCC sites and some are PCD clinical center sites. So okay. All of them will eventually be able to enter into the registry. The pilot is really phasing out right now, and we will be starting to have multiple sites entering soon. So actually that will be one of the webinars that we have in the future to talk about the role of the registry and where it's at. Question is, a ciliary biopsy and research genetic testing wouldn't be enough for research. Does insurance typically cover for lab testing? That I don't think that that's what we're saying here. It kind of depends on what the study sponsor wants to see. In terms of registry, just as an example, our registry will accept a ciliary biopsy that's been, interpreted correctly and read well as a confirmed diagnosis of PCD. And research genetic testing may be accepted or it may not. It kind of depends on the sponsor's viewpoint of that. We can't guarantee this every time, but what has happened so far is if the sponsor wants CLIA testing for someone to participate in research, they have picked up the cost for that. So it would be, kind of study specific, but that is one thing to be aware of. And, some of the commercial tests right now, if you just are interested in doing this on your own, some of them are not terribly expensive to families that don't want to run it through their insurance. So like $250 for a panel that includes all the PCD genes. So you know, there are options, and we can certainly talk about those more at length too.
There's a good question. Someone's asking if they're not able to participate in research, how can they help move things along in other ways?
That's a very good question. I think one of the ways to help move things along would be when we have opportunities to participate in a patient-reported registry or patient surveys or things where we're trying to get information directly from patients that will help guide future research direction. That would be a very important way to participate. And I think just as patients, if we share from in our own sphere what's going on with research, if we can't participate ourselves, if we can help other people learn about what's going on, that would be extremely helpful. If I have a genetic diagnosis but do not go to a center, who would I send the diagnosis to? We have a tentative timeline for the studies. Good question about the genetic diagnosis. If you're looking to participate in the registry, right now we would just probably have to hold off for a little bit until we get the patient-reported registry up, and then you could send the results could become part of that registry. If you're talking about a research study that's not the registry, it is just an actual sponsored research study, those results would go to probably the study sponsor who's looking to recruit patients. And if we have a tentative timeline of events, we have some things coming up very quickly, specifically a natural history study of adults with PCD, and you'll be hearing more about this very soon, but we need, you know, as many adults as rapidly as we can get them, because this is very specific to a potential study that could be really important for our community. So look for that very soon. We have a symptom-based therapy that will be probably within the next, hopefully within 2022, 2023. But sometimes we can't really talk a whole lot about these things because we're under non-disclosure agreements with the sponsors, but there are things coming up probably this year and some opportunities like within weeks or months. So stay tuned.
Another question is there a place you can go to see if you are on the registry and qualify for the various studies?
Right now, you would know if you were on the registry because you would have been entered through one of your sites, one of the 5 pilot sites, which are UNC, Seattle Children's, McGill, Toronto, and I always forget one, never fails. What is the third? Oh, Vanderbilt.
Oh.
Vanderbilt, the group that holds our central IRB, I forgot them. So you would have been at one of those sites and you would have signed a consent. That's how you would know that you're on the registry. So right now there's in our US, North American based registry, we have about 106 entrants. So it's not really well populated yet. That will change drastically as soon as we're done with this pilot and we can start getting the other sites entering. It does get confusing, and I will tell you that's something we always are a little bit concerned about. There are so many share your data and enter this registry kind of opportunities for people out there that it can be confusing to know, you know, if you've double entered, which one you should be participating in, which one actually will be of benefit. So I think we will have to probably come up with a way to, I guess I should probably not say a whole lot more. We're looking at a system that would allow you to kind of monitor your own information in a registry as patient-reported registry. And I think that we should be seeing something about that in the next couple of months as well. And that will be a really exciting way. That will be separate from the clinical registry, which is still going to be entered through our sites. And the reason that we're doing that is not to exclude people or not to be making things slow. It's to meet that standard of adequate and well-controlled trials that the FDA needs. So we have to have a set of data that we can be absolutely sure of. This is PCD, this is what the diagnostics look like, this is what the gene is. So that's what that's all about. But we want to also have information from the broader patient community because we know a lot of patients are not being seen at a center, so we don't want to leave them out. And what we're trying to do now figure out a way to make both of those work together, and hopefully there'll be more information about that soon. Is Carrie Kaufman on?
I didn't see her earlier. I don't know. Do you know when the pilot is ending and when new sites will be onboarded?
Carrie's not here. Is Michael O'Connor on?
I'm looking.
So the pilot is just about to wrap up. We have, so the, this is a, I didn't really want to get too much into the IRBs right now because that's a whole nother topic. But every time a site participates in human subjects research, they have to have what's called an institutional review board at their site, or an IRB, approve it. So there's a regulatory path to when we want to add a site to start being able to add patients to the registry. They have to get IRB approval to be able to do that. Plus they have to get contract approval and data sharing agreement from the university's business office. So we have, I think at last count, it was 18 sites that were in the process of doing those things, that either had gotten their regulatory approval and were waiting for the business approval, or vice versa. Usually the hardest part is getting the business contract signed. But progress is definitely being made on a lot of these, and we expect we should have 10 plus to start adding very quickly here once we work through all the contracting. Nothing is ever simple when you're dealing with human subjects research. Any other comments, questions? So one of the things that's very important, and is also a kind of a requirement that is for the FDA and for NIH. So the NIH is also a funder of research, probably the major funder of research in North America of medical research. And they really want to be sure that patient interests are represented, and that has got to be front and center in all of their studies. So when we look at these studies, when we're asked to provide input on study design, or is this something important to patients, we really want to be sure that we are including the patient voice, and that means including a broad spectrum of patients. So we really would strongly encourage people to get involved as we create this Patient and Family Advisory Council, and make sure that they're represented, that to the extent possible we are representing people from all walks of life with PCD. And our commitment to you can be that we will do everything in our power to make sure that we make it easy to participate in research to the extent possible, and make sure that these opportunities are made available to patients. But the reality is we've got to do this. Nobody can do PCD research for us. So it's really up to all of us to make it happen.
There's a couple of links posted in the chat for folks to check out current studies for the GDMCC and clinicaltrials.gov.
Okay, so yes, there will be a link to this recording at the end of the meeting. In fact, I think Lynn has a little compilation of a bunch of links she's going to send from different recent webinars.
Yes, and they're always available on the website on our PCDfoundation.org under About Us and blogs. They're up there for anyone that wants to go see them.
All right. Well, if there are no additional comments or questions, I think we can close it up. Thank you all for attending. And again, this will be this is the first of what will be a series, and we'll be getting more in depth into each of these topics in individual webinars in the future. In April, be looking for one that is going to be presented by Kelly Sullivan, who is really an expert at participating in research. So I think that's it. Thank you.